Hi everybody, welcome to my fourth video on IFRS 16 leases. In this video, I discuss the second qualifying condition that need to be checked, and that is right to control use of the asset. Now before I get into the details of right to control use, let us do a very quick recap on what is a lease. A lease under IFRS 16 is a contract that conveys the right to control use of an identified asset for a specific period in return for a consideration. Now, the conditions that we need to assess to conclude if a particular contract is a lease or not are identified asset and the right to control use. Now, identified asset I have covered in great detail in my previous videos. I will give the link to those videos in the description. The concept that I will be discussing in this video, which is right to control use. Let us assume that the identified asset is a building and our customer, Mr. Blue, wants to use this asset. We want to check whether Mr. Blue has the right to control use of the asset. First we check, is customer the king? That is, does Mr. Blue have the right to take important decisions relating to the use of the asset? This is known as the right to direct use of the asset. Now, the next thing that we check is money. That is, does Mr. Blue get substantially all the economic benefits relating to the use of the asset? So first, let us cover the more complicated right to direct use of the asset. Now, before we go to the next slide, I want you to note this very important difference between these two similar phrases. One is right to control use and the other is right to direct use. While right to direct use focuses on the decision-making rights of the customer, the right to control use is a combination of the decision-making rights as well as the right to get economic benefits. Right? So first, the right to direct use. As we said before, this is the right to make all important decisions relating to the use of the asset. As per the IFRS, the important decisions relating to the use of the asset relate to how and what purpose the asset is to be used. Now, please note that how and what purpose is a single concept. You do not need to split it. Now, an important point to note is that the customer's right to decide the how and what purpose of the use of the asset may be limited by a contract. This does not mean the customer automatically does not have the right to direct use. Even if these rights are limited by a contract, we need to check, can the customer decide on the how and what purpose of the use of the asset within the scope of the contract. So while our customer may be king, the lease contract will definitely be the emperor. Now, the standard itself has given us examples on what are those decisions that can be considered relevant to the how and what purpose of use. The questions what, where, when, and how much. I call them the Amma's questions because it reminds me of all the questions that my mom used to ask me before I used to go out with my friends. Right? Let us understand these questions with an example. Now, let us say that Mr. Blue wants to use a car. What are the decisions that are relevant to the how and what purpose of the use of the car? The first one is what. What will the customer or Mr. Blue use the car for? Can he decide whether he needs to use it for his personal use, whether he wants to ferry passengers, whether he wants to transport cargo? Can he make that decision? So this is the right to change the type of output, including the product mix. The next question is where. Very straightforward. Can he decide where to use the car? Can he use it within the city? Can he take it outside the city? Can he take it outside the country? Right? So this is a right to change where the output is produced. The third decision is when. Can Mr. Blue decide that he will not drive the car all day and take it out for a drive only in the night? So can he decide when the output is to be produced? And finally, how much? Let us say Mr. Blue does not want to use the car at all. He wants to leave it parked in his garage. So can he take that decision? Does he have the right to change whether the output will be produced at all? And if yes, how much of that output will be produced. But please note that this is not a comprehensive checklist. There can definitely be other decisions that may be relevant to the how and what purpose of an asset. In the same way, it is not necessary that a customer should have the right to make all these decisions. The decisions relevant to the how and what purpose of an asset differs from asset to asset. So when you assess, you need to apply your judgment and assess on a case-by-case basis. What you need to keep in mind is those decisions that are relevant to the economic benefit from an asset. It is those that are considered to be relevant to how and what purpose of the asset. Now, what do you think will happen if the how and what purpose of the use of the asset is predetermined? Will you automatically conclude that our poor customer does not have the right to direct use? No, not so fast. If the how and what purpose of use of the asset is predetermined by contract, for example, if Mr. Blue is allowed to use the car only within the city limits, or let us say the how and what purpose of the use of the asset is predetermined by the design of the asset. For example, this robotic arm can be used only to fit rear view mirrors of cars. In this case, the customer clearly has no right to decide the how and what purpose. But we cannot immediately say that the customer has no right to direct use. In these cases, where the how and what purpose is predetermined by either the contract or the design, the customer can still be the king, provided he has the right to operate or get other people to operate on his behalf the asset. The supplier should not be able to change his operating decisions. Or if the design itself was done by the customer. So the customer designed the asset in such a way that its how and what purpose was predetermined. In either of these cases, the customer is still said to have the right to direct use. Now, some additional notes relating to the right to direct use. The first one is supplier's protective rights. We already discussed that the how and what purpose may be defined by the contract. Now, if the contract contains conditions that are used for the protection of the supplier's rights or its personnel, or to ensure that the supplier complies with laws and regulations. So, such conditions in the contract are said to be supplier's protective rights. If the presence of supplier's protective rights in the contract restricts the right of our customer to decide the how and what purpose, you need to treat this exactly as how we treated the predetermination of how and what purpose by the contract. Now, the second thing is the right to operate and maintain the asset. Now, all of us know that operation and maintenance of an asset is a very important part of an asset. It is very important for the efficient use of the asset as well as to get economic benefits. But as per this standard, merely having the right to operate and maintain the asset will not give you the right to direct use. You have the right to direct use only if you are able to take relevant decisions relating to the how and what purpose of an asset. The only exception that we discussed is in the previous slide. That is, the right to operate and maintain an asset will give you the right to direct use only if the how and what purpose has been predetermined by contract or by design. Now, the third point is a wholly new one, and that is the right to take decisions before the period of use. Now, for example, let us say our customer can tell the supplier, you must produce this output, this much quantity, and of this quality. He specifies that. Can we say that he has a right to direct the use of the asset? No. In this case, his right is very similar to that of a purchaser of the goods. What the IFRS wants is that this customer should be able to take relevant decisions during the period of use. So, a customer who can take decisions only prior to the use of the asset is said to have no right to direct use. So that brings us to the end of the concept of right to direct use. We now go on to the more straightforward and easy topic of economic benefits. Let's use an example. Let us say our customer has leased machines relating to the extraction of coconut oil. In this case, what all will be the economic benefits? One, the primary output, that is the coconut oil itself. Second, the byproducts. So in this case, it would be coconut milk, coconut water, coconut husk, etc. And third thing, let us say he enters into a commercial transaction relating to this asset with a third party. For example, leasing this machine out. In this case, any rent that he receives would also be considered an economic benefit. So what do we need to assess? We need to assess whether the customer gets substantially all the economic benefits relating to the use of this asset. Now some additional notes. When we compute the economic benefits relating to the use of the asset, we should exclude the economic benefits accruing from the use of the asset that are outside the predetermined scope of a contract and that are outside the scope determined by the supplier's protective rights. The final point is a new one, and that is portion of cash flows. Now let us say Mr. Blue needs to give 50% of the cash flow that he earned on use of the car to the supplier. Would you still say that he has the right to get substantially all the economic benefits from the use of the asset? Intuitively, you will say no. I mean, if he has to shell out half of his cash flow, how can we say that he is getting the economic benefit? But the IFRS clearly says 100% of the cash flows that he gets from the use of that car will be considered as economic benefit accruing to him. Whatever he needs to pay to the supplier will be considered as consideration for the use of the asset that he pays after getting the economic benefit. Right, so that brings us to the end of the concept of right to control use. I want to do a quick recap with you using a flowchart before we end the video. So here you have assessed and concluded that there is an identified asset. Now you need to check whether the customer has the right to control use. What do you need to check? You test whether the customer decides the how and what purpose of the use of the asset. If he does decide it, then he has the right to direct use. If he does not decide it, then you check whether the how and what purpose of the asset has already been predetermined by contract or by design. If no, then the customer does not direct use. If yes, then you see whether the customer has the right to operate the asset without the supplier having the right to change those operating decisions. If yes, then he does have the right to direct use. If no, you check if it was the customer who had designed the asset in such a way that the how and what purpose has been predetermined. If yes, the customer has the right to direct use, and if no, the customer does not direct use. So, from the previous slide, we see that the customer may have the right to direct use or the customer does not direct use. If the customer does not direct use, he has no right to control use, and therefore this is not a lease under IFRS 16. Now, if the customer does have the right to direct use, then you check, does the customer get substantially all the economic benefits relating to the use of the asset? If yes, then the customer has the right to control use, and therefore this is a lease under IFRS 16. If no, then the customer has no right to control use, and therefore it is not a lease under IFRS 16. So that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope that it has helped you to understand the concept of right to control use. My next videos will be on accounting entries and illustrator examples of IFRS 16. And I'm really excited because that will be a big change from the usual PowerPoint format that I'm using. So super curious to know how that will shape up. Talk to you in my next video. Bye-bye.